I was unwinding at my waterfront condo when, at 5 a.m., the security alarm blared. The guard called nervously, "Your sister is here with movers. She claims you must move out, says she owns the place." I took a slow sip of coffee and grinned. Let her in. She's about to learn what I just did. Can you imagine waking up to the blare of your security alarm? A sound that shreds the silence like a knife, only to discover your own sister, the one you practically raised, is downstairs with a moving truck, insisting she owns your home? It wasn't a nightmare. It was 5 a.m. and my life, the one I'd painstakingly rebuilt, was about to be ripped apart. Or so they thought. That morning, the world outside my waterfront condo was still cloaked in darkness, broken only by the insistent, piercing beep of my building security alert. It was the kind of sound that yanks you from sleep, leaving your body tense, your mind racing before you even understand what's happening. As the automatic blinds began to rise, painting a thin line of dawn across the floor, the alarm kept screaming. Someone was trying to force their way in. I pushed myself upright, feeling that familiar, deep ache in my lower back. A constant reminder of the day everything changed for me. My condo on the 12th floor was my sanctuary, you know? The one place I could actually breathe without the weight of the world crushing my chest. But at 5 a.m., even that sanctuary felt impossibly fragile. My phone started vibrating on the nightstand. I rolled over, expecting some kind of malfunction, maybe a fire drill. Instead, it was Trent from security, and his voice. It shook in a way I'd never heard. He told me my sister, Lydia, and her husband, Bronson, were in the lobby. He said they'd arrived with a moving truck, and they were insisting they owned my place. They were demanding I come down immediately and leave, because they were taking possession today. For a few seconds, I just listened, silent. There was something almost surreal about hearing my life described as if it were already gone. But then, a cold clarity settled over me. I told Trent it was fine, just let them sign in. Get it documented. Then I wheeled myself toward the kitchen, reached for the mug I'd left on the counter. The coffee was cold, but that familiar bitterness, it grounded me. I took a slow sip, steady. It was the same kind of steadiness I used to feel right before a high-pressure briefing, back when I worked in the bureau before the accident. Before my legs stopped working and I had to learn a whole new version of myself. Outside, the harbor was silver and quiet, boats rocking gently, completely oblivious to the fact that my world was breaking open. I always wonder what people are doing when they listen to stories like mine. Maybe you're driving or folding laundry, or sitting with your own cup of coffee as the sun comes up. For me, that morning, I was sitting in my wheelchair near the open blinds, feeling the chill from the glass doors, trying to wrap my head around how my own sister could show up with a moving truck before dawn. I tapped into the lobby cameras on my phone. From above, I watched the sliding doors open. Lydia stepped inside, her arms crossed tight over her chest. She looked smaller than I remembered, almost folded into herself. Next to her was Bronson, her husband, calm as still water, tapping a folder against his leg. Behind them, two half-awake movers stood by a bright white truck. They looked confused, like they weren't sure if they were part of something legal or something messy. But they were there because they were being paid. Trent approached them. Even without sound, I could tell he was trying to explain protocol. Residents don't just lose ownership overnight. The movers kept glancing at Bronson's folder, like it was some kind of magic permission slip. Lydia rubbed her forehead, looking toward the elevators, expecting me to appear. They all stood under the warm glow of the lobby chandelier while outside, the sky shifted from charcoal to pale blue. Watching them on screen, I felt incredibly calm. Not numb, not detached, just steady. This was the moment everything had led to. The subtle lies, the little stories whispered about my memory lapses. Neighbors suddenly asking if I was sleeping poorly or forgetting things. I remembered the look on May's face at the cafe, just a few days ago, asking if I was doing all right. If it was true I sometimes woke up shouting from nightmares. I remembered Lydia's voice trembling when she brought up helping me manage my finances, so I wouldn't stress myself. At the time, those things felt strange but not alarming. Now, they lined up perfectly, falling into place like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was solving. The lobby camera shifted angles. It caught Bronson turning to Lydia, touching her elbow gently, as if calming her. To anyone else it would have looked caring. But I knew better. That touch had purpose. Manipulators always cloak control in gentleness. I studied his face. His jaw was tight. His eyes kept flicking toward the elevators. Whatever he had planned, today was supposed to be his victory lap. He thought he'd outsmarted me. He thought he'd laid the perfect trail and I would just crumble. I took another sip of cold coffee, letting the bitterness settle. There was something almost poetic about watching them stand there, in my building, waiting to take the home that had become my lifeline. I had rebuilt myself in this condo. I learned how to move through pain, how to breathe when anxiety gripped my ribs so tightly I thought they might crack. I cried in that living room, laughed on that balcony. This space had held my broken pieces until I could put myself back together. And here they were, believing that with one morning surprise, they could erase me. I set my cup down and rolled closer to the window. The sun was fully rising now, turning the harbor bright gold. Boats nudged gently against their ropes. I brushed a strand of hair from my cheek and let the moment settle. This wasn't a crisis. This was the opening act of a story I had already prepared for. They were walking straight into the plan I'd finished just one day earlier. Every detail arranged, every document secured, every piece of evidence gathered. They had no idea. Trent looked up toward the camera, maybe knowing I was watching. His shoulders lifted, as if to ask if he should stall them, call the police, quietly escort them out. I didn't need any of that. I opened the microphone to his station. "Trent," I said, my voice clear, "let them in. Allow them to write their names in the visitor log." I wanted everything documented, every step recorded. When I ended the connection, the condo felt strangely quiet. The alarm had stopped. The blinds were fully open. The gentle clink of halyards against masts drifted up from the marina. I sat there, hands resting on the wheels of my chair, breathing evenly. They didn't know what I had done yesterday, and they were about to learn. Before that morning in the lobby, before the moving truck, the cold coffee, and the calm in my chest that even surprised me, there was another version of me. One I sometimes still wake up searching for in the dark. Back in 2019, I wasn't a woman in a wheelchair in a San Diego condo. I was running on adrenaline and coffee in a different way, chasing shadows for the bureau, working in counterintelligence. My days were measured in briefings, field reports, coded conversations I couldn't talk about at family dinners. I had a body that did what I asked, and a mind that believed I could outrun anything. When people think about accidents, they imagine one dramatic impact. The truth is, the moment that changed everything for me started small. A strange pattern in financial records, a familiar name on an unfamiliar list, a lead that looked like nothing, then refused to go away. We followed it into a late-night car, into a surveillance op that should have been straightforward. It wasn't. I remember pieces. The wet pavement, the glare of headlights, the sickening feeling when another vehicle came out of nowhere, running from a different crime, intersecting with ours in the worst possible way. The world tilted. Metal screamed. Glass rained down like tiny, cold stars. Then, nothing. When I woke in the hospital, drugs softening the edges, I learned they thought they'd lose me. Then, that I would live, but my legs would never carry me the same way. My spine had paid the price. There would be rehab, chairs, limits I'd never imagined. The bureau did what it could. Medals, handshakes, words about service and sacrifice. Eventually, a settlement. A carefully calculated number, the monetary value of my lost mobility. $2 million. And donations started pouring in from strangers. Touched me in a way that made my throat ache. It was also overwhelming. I didn't grow up thinking about money on that scale. My childhood was modest. My parents kept the lights on, the fridge never completely empty. They gave us love. Then, in 2010, a drunk driver crossed a line he shouldn't have. My world split again. Mom and Dad were there one moment, gone the next. No lingering illness, no gentle fade. Just a phone call, a crash, and then silence. I was 17. My little sister, Lydia, was 11. Wide-eyed, with a laugh that broke out of her without warning. The state could have stepped in. Guardianships, foster options. I looked at my sister, and I knew there was no way I'd let her be raised by strangers. So I did what I always did. I made a plan. I worked. I studied. I took care of bills while other kids went to high school dances. There were nights I'd sit at the kitchen table, doing homework after putting Lydia to bed, feeling the crushing weight of it all. This role I never asked for. Then I'd wipe my face, finish my assignments, and wake up to do it again. In some ways, becoming an agent felt like an extension of that. I was good at carrying burdens quietly, at watching instead of speaking, at seeing the lines people drew and the ones they tried to cross. The training was grueling, but it was almost a relief to face challenges with structure, rules, clear objectives. The accident didn't just break my spine. It broke that certainty. After months in rehab, learning to transfer from bed to chair, navigating ramps and narrow doors, and the way strangers avoided my eyes, I had to make another decision. I couldn't stay in a city where every corner reminded me of the life I'd lost. I needed somewhere that felt like air again. Somewhere my lungs could expand without bumping into old ghosts. San Diego ended up on my list for one simple reason. The ocean. I'd visited once as a teenager, a 3-day trip with Mom and Dad. It lived in my memory like a treasure. The salty, sweet air. The sun dipping into the water like it was slipping into bed. When the final paperwork came, I sat with it all spread out and thought about where a woman like me could rebuild. The answer kept coming back to that coastline. I used part of the settlement to buy a small 1-bedroom condo at Harborline Towers. Not extravagant by some standards, but to me it was a palace. Ramps, elevators, security staff who knew my name. The first night I slept there, propped on pillows, the sliding door opened just enough to let in the sound of the water. I cried quietly. Not entirely from sadness. It was grief and gratitude, tangled together. Lydia visited often in those first months. Takeout containers, new plants, stories from her job as an event planner's assistant. She had a knack for describing people. We'd sit on the balcony, my chair angled toward the horizon, her legs tucked under her. Sometimes she'd go quiet, look at my chair, then away. That hurt, but it was honest. We'd both lost something in my accident. The sister she'd known, the one who could chase her, spin her in circles, was gone. In her place was a woman who still teased her about TV shows, but now had to ask for help reaching certain shelves. At night, after she left, the condo felt too large. The ocean sounds, soothing until they weren't. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it came with images I couldn't control. Headlights bearing down. The spin of tires losing traction. The weightlessness before impact. I'd jerk awake, heart hammering, breath sawing in and out, clutching the sheets like I could still grab a steering wheel that wasn't there. Those episodes started to repeat. An echo built into my nights. Sometimes I'd hear myself make a small sound. Not quite a cry, but not silence either. A low, startled noise. If Lydia was staying over, she'd sometimes knock gently on my bedroom door in the morning, asking if I'd slept okay. I'd shrug it off, say I was fine, just restless. The new meds made my dreams too vivid. It was easier than watching worry bloom in her face. That pattern settled into the rhythm of my new life. Therapy appointments, physical therapy, coffee with May downstairs. On the surface, it probably looked like resilience. A woman who took a devastating injury and carved out a careful, stable existence in a sunny city. But underneath, there were cracks. I felt them when a siren screamed too close. When a stranger pushed past my chair without apologizing. When I saw families walking hand in hand along the harbor. Parents carrying sleepy but safe kids. There were days I missed mom and dad with an ache that felt physical. Lydia remained my anchor through most of it. She called often, sent memes. She started talking about a man she'd met through work. Bronson. Smart, funny, understood contracts. She described how he listened. How he made her feel safe. Like she didn't have to worry about practical details anymore. He always seemed to have a plan. At the time, those words sounded like a blessing. After everything we'd been through, I wanted her to have someone kind. I didn't yet know that the same traits that made him seem so responsible in her eyes would look very different in mine. There's a cruel irony in how my own trauma would become the tool he used. The nights I startled awake, the bad dreams, the moments my voice shook a little as I told Lydia I was fine. Those private vulnerabilities would eventually be spun into a story about a woman who couldn't be trusted with her own life. The accident didn't stop hitting me when the car stopped moving. Its shockwaves kept traveling outward, touching people and choices years later. But back then, in those quieter months, I was just a woman in recovery, doing my best to build a new routine out of broken pieces. I didn't yet know how much of my life had been noted, studied. How Lydia's new boyfriend would file away every small detail. I didn't know he'd read the article about the injured agent, the large settlement. That he'd already pictured Harborline Towers before he ever shook my hand. All I knew was I was tired, and hopeful, and trying to trust that the worst was behind us. Bronson Reeves entered our lives the following spring. Lydia showed up at my condo one afternoon with a brightness I hadn't seen in a long time. A pale blue dress that swayed when she walked. She talked so fast I had to remind her to breathe. She'd met him at a corporate event, a paralegal who helped with a last-minute contract. Smart, calm, made everything feel manageable. When she spoke about him, something softened in her expression. My heart lifted. After everything she'd endured, I wanted her to have someone who didn't hurt her. He came by a week later. Lydia invited him for coffee so I could meet him. He arrived exactly on time, carried a small box of pastries, placed it on my counter with a polite smile. He thanked me for letting him visit, said I had a beautiful place, asked how long I'd lived there. His voice was warm, steady, practiced. Not fake exactly, more like someone who had experience putting others at ease. If I'd met him under different circumstances, I might have thought him genuinely thoughtful. He sat across from me, turning his coffee mug, as Lydia talked about her week. He'd add a supportive detail, a gentle tease. He asked me questions about my rehab, if the building was comfortable, about the view. Harmless questions on the surface. Yet even then, I noticed the way his eyes flicked around the condo. Not admiration, not curiosity, but calculation. As if he was taking inventory of more than furniture. I brushed the thought aside. People look around when they visit new places. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, that years in the bureau had hardwired me to look for things that weren't always there. I've been trying so hard to stop seeing every stranger as a potential threat. Kept me alive in one world, but it was exhausting in this new one. As summer moved in, Bronson became a regular. Picking Lydia up from the lobby, meeting her at the cafe. I often saw them from the balcony, his hand lightly on her back. He had a way of seeming attentive without being clingy, charming without being showy. Even May at the cafe commented on how put together he seemed. She said he had a kindly face and always tipped well. Those were the details that shaped impressions quickly in a building like ours. One morning, I went downstairs for coffee. May handed me my regular order before I could even ask. Then she asked if I'd been sleeping all right. I paused, caught off guard. She said Lydia had mentioned I sometimes made noises in my sleep, that I might still be having nightmares. She asked if I ever woke up disoriented, or if I had someone checking on me. I felt something tighten in the back of my throat. The question didn't feel random, felt planted. I told her I was fine, just adjusting to new medication. She nodded in that gentle, worried way older women sometimes do when they're not sure they should push further. It hovered just beneath the surface. Even as I rolled out of the cafe and back toward the elevator, I pushed the button, listening to the quiet hum of the building. When the door opened, a middle-aged man, a resident who usually kept to himself, passed me. He slowed just a little and asked if everything was all right in my unit. He said the lock on my door looked weak. That struck me as strange because I was meticulous about that sort of thing. Trauma sharpens habits like lock-checking. I never left my door unsecured. I told him I hadn't. He gave a small, awkward smile before walking away. The elevator ride to the 12th floor felt longer than usual. I replayed his question. Something was off about how he'd phrased it, like he was repeating something he'd been told, not something he'd personally seen. When I reached my floor, the hallway felt different. Not physically, but as if whispers had trailed through it. People in buildings like ours talk. They notice when someone struggles, when someone changes routines. And if someone wanted to shape a narrative about me, about my mental stability. This was the perfect environment. I unlocked my door, moved inside, and closed it. For a moment, I stayed still, letting the quiet settle. The condo felt familiar and safe, yet a sliver of unease had found its way in. Had Lydia mentioned my rough nights to anyone else? Had I said something while half awake? It was possible, but the timing felt too deliberate. 2 conversations in one morning, touching the same nerve, both wrapped in concern, but threaded with implication. I went to the balcony. The world looked calm and predictable from up here, but inside my mind, a quiet alarm had begun to ring. I thought back to Bronson's first visit. The way he glanced at my medical equipment. The way he lingered over the framed news article about my accident. The way he asked gently if I ever felt overwhelmed living alone, in isolation. None of those things would have been remarkable alone. Together, they formed a shape I could no longer ignore. Bronson had access to legal knowledge. He understood guardianships, power of attorney. If he had been planting ideas quietly through Lydia, through casual conversations with neighbors, then what I felt as unease might have been something much more intentional. I rolled back inside. My hand wrapped around the warm coffee May had given me. My heart wasn't racing, but it was alert, tuned like an instrument. Something was happening, something I hadn't invited, but that had been carefully set in motion. And if I was right, the little comments and worried questions weren't random. They were rehearsal lines in a story someone was trying to tell about me. I knew then that it was time to pay close attention, to watch what Bronson said and how he said it, to listen not just to my sister's words, but the weight behind them, to trace the shape forming in the shadows before it solidified into something harder to undo. The accident had taken my legs, but it had not taken my instincts. The next morning, I rolled into my living room with a steady focus I hadn't felt since my bureau days. My condo had always been a refuge. Now I looked at the walls differently. The entryway, the hallway, the doors. Any point of access. Any place where someone with the wrong intentions could slip in unnoticed. I had no desire to become paranoid again. But I also knew how manipulation began. It always started quietly. People with intentions like Bronson never lunged first. They tiptoed. They asked questions that seemed harmless. They presented concern as care. And if no one questioned them, their confidence grew until they pushed hard enough to cause irreparable damage. So, I went back to my training piece by piece. I started with camera installation. Nothing expensive or dramatic, just high-quality devices that blended in. One in the hallway, pointed toward the front door. One in the small foyer where my mail usually dropped. Another near the bedroom, positioned high enough you'd never see it unless you knew exactly where to look. I set each one to record continuously, transmitting footage to a secure cloud server that Bronson would never know existed. The last camera I placed near the window that faced the internal corridor outside my unit. I used to think those open-air hallways felt airy and safe. Now I watched them the way I would watch an alley during surveillance, tracing movement, memorizing faces, learning patterns. I tested each camera. When I finally sat back in my chair and viewed the synced feeds from my tablet, something settled in me. I was not helpless. I was not off balance. I had tools. I had a strategy. And despite what Bronson hoped, my mind was clear. It only took 3 days for the first confirmation. I'd left the building for physical therapy, returning earlier than planned. When I accessed the feed from my hallway camera, I saw Bronson, standing outside my door. He glanced left, then right, reached into his pocket for something metallic. He stood there, in clean, deliberate silence, inserting a key, cracking the door open just enough to slip in, pulling it shut behind him. My hand stayed steady on the tablet as I watched him move through my home. He walked with eerie confidence, like someone who had already measured the space. He checked the drawers near the living room, paused near my bookshelf, then walked toward the bedroom hallway. He opened the small filing cabinet beside my desk, sifted carefully through documents, placing some back, moving others slightly out of place. He was looking for paperwork, ownership documents, settlement papers, anything that could be twisted into the narrative he was building. I watched him close the drawer, smooth the surface with his fingertips. He left without taking anything. That meant he wasn't finished yet. He was scouting. When Lydia came to my condo that evening for dinner, she had no idea. She talked about work, about a demanding wedding client, about a coworker. When she mentioned Bronson had borrowed her spare key earlier that afternoon to check on a delivery at his place, something clicked. He had used her kindness against her, without hesitation. I waited until she had gone home before I pulled out the old contact notebook from my desk drawer. I hadn't touched it in years. Near the back were names I used to call often. Names that still felt familiar when I ran my fingers over them. One of those names was Dorian Hale. Dorian worked with me in the bureau before I was injured. He had a talent for details, especially written ones. He could look at handwriting like a biologist looked at cell structures. After I left, he moved into private consulting. We'd exchanged holiday messages, but rarely more. I called him anyway. When he answered, his voice carried the same mix of dry humor and sharp intelligence I remembered. He asked how I was holding up. I told him I needed a favor. He said he owed me more than one. I emailed him a handful of documents Lydia had brought over a few days earlier. She said Bronson found them through a colleague, that they were supposed to help her organize some financial matters in case anything ever happened to me. I remembered feeling uneasy then. The wording had been vague. The signature sections had too many preparatory clauses. Now I saw them clearly for what they were. Preparatory steps toward a guardianship claim, or a transfer of authority. Dorian called me back that same night. He asked if I was sitting down. I told him the chair was a permanent part of my life now. So yes, technically I was already sitting. He told me the signatures were not mine. They were very close. Close enough that someone unfamiliar with my writing would believe them. But they weren't exact. The slope of certain letters was off. The pressure pattern inconsistent with my dominant hand. He said whoever forged them had legal knowledge but not artistic skill. The signature range of paralegals who learned forgery through exposure rather than training. My stomach went cold. I asked him if this could hold up in court. He said absolutely not. The signatures were flawed enough that any handwriting specialist would detect fabrication. He asked if I wanted him to prepare an official report. I told him not yet. I needed to understand the full scope of what Bronson was building. After the call, I sat in the dim light of my living room for a long time. Harborline Towers always felt safe to me. Now the air inside my unit felt heavier. I began to think back to the earliest days after my accident. The news articles that had circulated when the settlement was finalized. The local paper ran a feature about my service, the mission, how the community had rallied to support me. Photos. Me before a row of flags. Me in my wheelchair accepting a certificate. Anyone with enough time and curiosity could have found those stories. Anyone with a certain kind of ambition could have followed the trail. And if they discovered I had one younger sister and no other family, and that I was financially stable but physically vulnerable, then my life would have looked like an opportunity. I hadn't wanted to believe Bronson targeted us. But now, watching the pieces fall into place, there was no other explanation. I turned off the main lights and let the condo fall into shadow. Only the soft glow from the balcony filtered into the room. I took a deep breath and let it sit in my lungs before I released it. Bronson wasn't just manipulating Lydia. He was constructing a narrative about me, preparing evidence, testing access, forging signatures, planting concerns in the community. He was laying the groundwork for something bigger. And I knew then that if I didn't act quickly and precisely, he would take everything I had left. The hardest part was knowing Lydia still believed he loved her. That she didn't know she had been chosen long before she ever offered him her first smile. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that truth. Then I opened them again with the calm of someone who had rebuilt themselves from the ground up before, and could do it again. I had the cameras. I had the footage. I had the handwriting analysis. The picture was forming clearly. Now I needed to decide how to use it, and how far I was willing to go to stop the man who thought he'd already figured out how to own my life. The answer came sooner than I expected. 2 days after my call with Dorian, I was home on a slow Tuesday afternoon. The sky over the harbor was that soft marine layer that made everything look slightly washed in silver. My physical therapy session had canceled, so I was catching up on emails at my small desk. My legs were covered with a light blanket, my chair angled so I could see both the water and the front door if anyone came by. There was a knock, 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. A pattern I had started to recognize. Bronson did everything with a pattern. I rolled to the door and checked the peephole. He stood there alone, wearing a polo shirt and jeans, holding a slim black folder and what looked like a small toolkit. His expression was the picture of polite concern. For a moment I considered not answering, pretending I was out or sleeping. But there is a point where avoidance becomes surrender, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. I opened the door enough to meet his eyes. He told me he'd gotten a call from Lydia. She'd mentioned I'd spoken about some flickering lights in the hallway last week. And since he knew a little about electrical systems and had a buddy in building maintenance, he thought he'd drop by and check that everything was safe. I had never said anything to Lydia about flickering lights. I said the condo was fine, that if there were issues the building manager would handle it. He insisted in that gentle way of his. He didn't want me worrying about things that could be dangerous, he said. After everything I'd been through, I didn't need one more stress. What could I say to that without sounding ungrateful or hostile? People like Bronson counted on that hesitation, the way decent people don't want to seem rude. So I stepped back and let him in. My face calm, my mind sharp. I had positioned one of the small cameras high in the living room, angled toward the entryway and my desk. As he walked past, I mentally checked its field of view. It had him perfectly. He did a quick, half-hearted check of the recessed lights near the front door, touching the switch, glancing up as if looking for a problem. Then, almost casually, he drifted toward my desk. He asked if my laptop ever gave me trouble, if the outlet there had any issues. Before I could answer, he was already there, reaching behind the desk, fiddling with the power strip. From his body language, anyone else might have thought he was checking connections. I knew better. His eyes kept sliding toward the small filing cabinet beside the desk, the one he'd rifled through last time. I told myself to stay still, to let him show himself. He straightened up and mentioned that sometimes power surges could affect electronics. He asked if he could move a few things to get a better sense of where the cables were. I nodded, watched him pull my desk chair slightly aside. He rested a hand on the file cabinet, as if using it to balance. Then he opened the top drawer with the same casual motions someone uses to scratch an itch. He didn't realize I'd rearranged everything after his last visit. Neatly labeled folders, copies of my settlement documents, my official ID from the bureau, tax returns. He flipped through them with practiced fingers, pausing a little too long on anything that mentioned account numbers or property details. I sat a few feet away, my hands folded in my lap, my face neutral. Inside, my thoughts were ticking, one by one, like an old safe dial. He asked if I'd ever thought about simplifying some of that paperwork. He said that with my medical history, it might make sense to put certain things in a structure that would protect me if anything happened. The way he said, if anything happened, landed like a pebble tossed into a still pond. I asked him what he meant. He launched into what I'm sure he thought was a reassuring explanation. He finished checking the outlet, put the folders back, slightly out of alignment, then spoke about trusts and family entities and shared decision-making. His tone stayed light, conversational, as if he was discussing recipes instead of legal control. He said that with me living alone, dealing with trauma from the accident, giving Lydia and him some authority over major decisions could help. He said it would make things simpler if my health ever declined. He didn't say if my mind ever declined, but the implication sat right there between us. After he left, I waited until the door shut and his footsteps faded. Then I rolled back to my desk and opened the camera feeds. I watched the scene again, this time with the distance of a third-person observer. It was all there, his pretext about the lights, his hand on the file cabinet, his quick scan of the labels, his little speech about trusts. Later that week, Lydia came over for dinner. She brought pasta and 2 small containers of salad. We ate at the table, the balcony door cracked open. She seemed a little distracted, twisting her napkin as she talked. Halfway through the meal, she cleared her throat. She wanted to ask me something, but she didn't want me to take it the wrong way. My stomach tightened, even though my voice stayed level. Go ahead. She said she and Bronson had been talking about my future. That's exactly how she phrased it. My future. She said they worried about how much stress I carried on my own. The bills, the security, the investments. She reminded me I'd been through so much, that I deserved to rest more. Then she repeated, almost word for word, what Bronson had said about shared responsibility. She told me Bronson knew all kinds of options in the legal world. Lawyers who helped families in situations like mine. She said maybe we should set up something where they could help manage things so I wouldn't have to. The words hung in the air. They came out of her mouth, but they carried his fingerprints. I asked her gently if she worried that I wasn't capable of keeping up with my own life. She rushed to say no, it wasn't like that. She knew I was smart and organized. She just didn't want me to feel alone. Then she added something that cut more deeply than she probably realized. She said that sometimes I did seem a little forgetful, especially after a bad night. Maybe it would be a relief to have help. It's a strange thing, hearing your own vulnerability used as evidence against you, even when it's wrapped in concern. I looked at her across the table. This young woman I had raised from 11. This person whose scraped knees I'd bandaged. She truly believed she was protecting me. She trusted Bronson so completely that his suggestions felt like her own ideas. I realized, in that moment, how deeply he had woven himself into her. It wasn't enough for him to use my trauma. He was also using her love for me, bending it, twisting it, pointing it back at me as justification. I told her I appreciated her care. I told her I would think about it. That seemed to calm her. She relaxed into the rest of the evening, talking about work. But the damage had been done. The seed had been planted, and I had heard exactly where it came from. A few days later, a piece of mail arrived that made everything even clearer. It was a thick envelope, addressed not to me personally, but to something called Dalla Family Trust, LLC. The return address belonged to a financial services firm in the city. Their glossy brochures specialized in managing properties and assets for families who needed a sophisticated approach to wealth protection. I held that envelope in my hands. The weight of it wasn't physical. The company name, my last name embedded in it without my permission. The implication that some entity already existed to hold my assets. I had never authorized anything like that. Opened it carefully. Inside, a welcome packet, thanking Dalla Family Trust LLC for choosing their firm. References to upcoming consultations about real estate and investment portfolios. Language about consolidating holdings. Nowhere did my full name appear as a person, only as part of the trust. I could almost see Bronson, sitting somewhere with a laptop, filling out online forms, using enough information from old news articles to construct something that looked legitimate to anyone who didn't know better. He wasn't guessing anymore. He had moved from reconnaissance to structure building. I gathered the documents and placed them in a new folder, one marked very clearly in my mind as preparation for war. He had shown his hand now. He wasn't just thinking about controlling some of my decisions. He was preparing to move my home and my settlement money into a container he controlled. A legal shell with my family name on it, designed to make theft look like management. Standing there in my kitchen, with the harbor light fading, and that envelope open, I felt a familiar coldness settle in my chest. Not fear, not anger, a focused, almost clinical resolve. He had made his move. Now it was my turn. Those words stayed with me long after I left her office, echoing in my mind the whole drive back to Harborline Towers. The late afternoon sun was still bright over the marina, scattering ribbons of gold across the water. I felt the warmth through the window as I rolled inside my condo. But underneath that warmth was something tighter, more braced. The kind of feeling I used to get before a high-risk interview, when everything depended on staying calm and letting the truth rise on its own. I had spent the morning with Maribel Stone, one of the sharpest probate attorneys in San Diego. She had listened without interruption as I laid out the timeline. The forged signatures, the LLC envelope, the camera footage, the pattern of manipulation creeping through the building. When I finished, she leaned back, her face thoughtful, rearranging puzzle pieces that already made sense. She confirmed what I had already suspected. Bronson was circling incompetence claims, setting up a shell company to sweep my assets into. He dabbled in forgery. She told me a man like him rarely moved without expecting to hold advantage. The only way to beat such a person was to remove that advantage before he reached it, which is exactly what we did yesterday. We built a special needs asset protection trust, designed specifically for people with long-term disabilities who needed their financial assets shielded from exploitation. Within that structure, my condo no longer appeared in my name. My accounts were transferred under the trust registration. Every document and deed refiled, sealed by the San Diego County Probate Court, stamped and protected. I retained full authority, but no one else could invoke guardianship attempts against me without hitting legal concrete. Bronson thought he was one step away from taking what was mine. He was actually walking into a wall I had built in a single afternoon. When the clerk handed Maribel the stamped order, the reality hit me more deeply than I expected. My condo, the settlement I'd fought so hard to rebuild my life with, the savings I guarded so carefully, no longer vulnerable to anyone's scheme, especially not his. I rolled across the condo, letting my fingertips brush the back of the sofa. I could hear faint laughter from the pool deck below, the splash of water, the distant hum of a boat motor. Everything looked so ordinary, and yet, under the surface, everything had changed. I went to the balcony and let the ocean air wash over me. The scent of salt pulled old memories forward. Dad driving us down the coast road. Mom leaning out the window. Lydia in the back seat, getting orange juice all over her chin. I could almost hear Dad calling out directions. Grief comes in layers. It never really leaves, but sometimes it offers a quiet reminder. Standing there, I felt their absence and their presence at once. It made me even more certain that I could not let someone like Bronson touch anything connected to our name. Inside, my phone buzzed. A text from Lydia. She said she might stop by later just to talk. My heart tightened, not out of fear, but sadness. She had no idea what she was caught in. No idea that the man she believed was looking out for her had been looking at my life like a spreadsheet to be reorganized. I texted back that she was welcome. Then I moved to the living room, opened my laptop, and reviewed the camera feeds again. Not because I needed more evidence, but because watching the precision of his intrusions reminded me that he had made his decision long before any of us recognized it. The footage from last week showed him entering with her spare key, pausing at the filing cabinet, opening drawers with a confidence that didn't belong to someone simply checking on electrical issues. His steps were deliberate, his focus exact. He believed no one would ever question him. I clicked through the recording slowly, letting each clip play out. My spine prickled, the way it used to before operations that required patience more than force. I thought about the outline Maribel had drawn for me, the legal protections now in place. It felt like someone had locked a steel door behind me, not one that trapped me inside, but one that ensured no one could push their way through again. As evening settled, Lydia arrived. She let herself in with the soft knock she'd used since she was a girl. When she stepped into the living room, she looked tired, her shoulders drawn up slightly, as if holding a weight she didn't understand. Her eyes flicked instantly to my chair, then to the table where some documents were spread out. She hesitated. I asked how she was. She sat on the edge of the sofa, twisting her fingers together, the way she always did when something troubled her. She mentioned Bronson seemed stressed lately, busy, preoccupied. He'd been talking more about planning for the future, about responsibilities, about making sure everything was handled properly if something ever happened. There it was again, that phrase. Those quiet, rehearsed lines. I asked her gently if she ever felt like he wanted control, not help. She blinked, confused, and shook her head. She said he just cared. She said he just wanted what was best for us. The ache in my chest deepened. She meant it. I changed the subject before her worry grew. We talked about her week, about a wedding venue. She described the decor, the catering disaster narrowly avoided. She made me laugh, and for a moment, the air around us felt normal again. Later, when she left, I watched from the balcony as she crossed the street. She paused at the curb and looked up at my unit. Her expression was unreadable from that distance, but something about the tilt of her head made my heart twist. I had protected her since she was 11. I had stepped into the role mom and dad left behind without hesitation. Losing her trust, even briefly, felt like losing a part of myself. I turned back inside and rolled to the kitchen island where the trust documents were neatly stacked in a folder. I placed my palm lightly on top. These pages weren't only legal protection. They were the boundary I had never expected to need against someone who had married into my family. I closed the folder and slid it into the drawer by my desk. Then I sat quietly, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint groan of the building settling for the night. The lights from the harbor flickered across the ceiling. Maribel had been right. Everything was in place. The court had sealed the trust yesterday. The transfers were complete. The structure was solid. Now all that remained was to wait for the moment when Bronson pushed too far. The moment he believed he had already won. The moment he walked directly into the trap he had no idea existed. I spent the rest of that night preparing for what needed to come next. Maribel had told me that the structure of the trust was airtight, that no one could penetrate it without leaving a trail so bright even a first-year law student could follow it. But she also reminded me that people like Bronson rarely stopped at the first obstacle. When one door sealed shut, they tried another. When one angle failed, they shifted. What we needed was an action so explicit that nothing he said later could blur or excuse it, which meant giving him the chance to act. So the next morning, I began my performance. I called a rideshare in full view of the lobby camera and wheeled myself into the car with my overnight bag. I told the concierge I would be out of town for a few days, visiting an old friend. I left cheerful messages in the resident app, thanking people for watering plants. I made sure every detail felt effortless and believable. Then I had the driver circle the block twice and drop me at the rear entrance of the building, the one used mainly for deliveries. I slipped back in through the service hallway and rode the freight elevator up to my floor. No resident saw me. No one but the night shift staff would know I was inside. My condo felt strangely theatrical after that. I closed the blinds, dimmed the lights, and rolled quietly into the bedroom. It was the only room with no reason for him to enter, and the only place where I could stay hidden without risk of being seen through the glass. I set my laptop on the edge of the bed, opened the security feeds, and let all 6 camera windows arrange themselves across the screen. It felt like sitting in a small operations van again. The glow, the quiet hum of electronics, the way the world outside became a series of moving squares. The first day passed without incident. I watched maintenance workers vacuum, delivery drivers drop off packages. Lydia texted once, asking if my trip was going well. I answered with a simple "arrived safely." The second day was the same, uneventful, almost disappointingly so, but patience had been part of my training once. I still knew how to use it. On the third day, while the harbor lay under bright sunlight, and the city moved through its early afternoon rhythms, everything shifted. At 2:14 p.m., my hallway camera registered motion. The pixel alert turned bright green. Then the feed showed Bronson walking toward my door, with a familiarity that made my stomach tighten. He looked around the corridor once, twice, then reached into his pocket, pulled out the stolen key. He worked quickly, sliding it into the lock, pressing the door open with his shoulder. He stepped inside without hesitation, and let the door fall shut behind him. It hit me in a quiet wave. If I had truly been gone, this moment would have marked the first official step in losing everything I owned. The thought made my chest squeeze, but I forced myself to stay silent and watch. He moved through the condo with ease, not bothering to pretend. He walked to the dining table first and lifted a stack of my mail, sifted through it without care, tossing aside anything he didn't want. Then he went to my living room, pausing in front of the large windows as if imagining the space belonging to him. He took out his phone and began taking pictures. Wide shots, close shots of the built-in shelving, angled shots of the kitchen counters. He sent them to someone. I could see the messages pop across the top of his screen in the feed. 3 images at a time. No commentary, just photos. Then he spoke to himself. The microphone on my camera picked up every word. "She won't see a single penny of this," he said. "This condo belongs to me." He said this was the easiest transfer he'd ever executed, that it would all look perfectly legal by the time he was done. I sat very still in the bedroom, listening to his voice. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. For a moment, there was no anger, only a cold familiarity with the kind of person who could say such things out loud. He truly believed it. He walked toward my desk and opened the same drawer he'd searched before. He glanced over the folders again, muttering that he needed the right paper sign to finish the transition. He said that once those signatures were in place, the trust would be locked and Lydia would hold everything through him. He said that no court would bother listening to a disabled woman if there were concerns about her competency. That was when the laptop on the bed buzzed with an incoming call. I recognized the caller ID instantly. Lydia. I waited a beat before answering. If she heard too much silence, she would worry. I tried to keep my voice light when I said hello. She sounded out of breath. Her words rushed. She asked where I was and if I had a minute. Then she said Bronson had mentioned something important before leaving their apartment. Something about needing me to sign a few documents for my protection. She repeated that phrase exactly the way he did. For my protection. She said she didn't want to pressure me, but he told her my condo and finances needed coverage. He said my trust had been misfiled. He said things could get complicated if I didn't sign soon. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting her voice settle. She had no idea what she was saying. No idea she was standing on a line he had drawn for her. I asked her calmly if she believed I was unable to make decisions. If she believed I was losing track of things. If she believed I was someone who couldn't run her own life anymore. She whispered no, but she sounded unsure, as if someone had been making her doubt her own thoughts. She said Bronson had shown her examples of people who needed help managing their affairs. He told her that sometimes trauma made people forgetful. He'd suggested gently that maybe I needed a little guidance. I let her speak. It was painful hearing how deeply he had shaped her perception, but I needed her words recorded. The call system on my laptop captured every sound. In the living room, Bronson continued rummaging. He opened the cabinet under the TV, checked the drawers by the kitchen sink, pulled open the closet by the entryway. He moved with purpose. He even hummed softly, as if nothing in the world could go wrong for him today. I told Lydia that I loved her. That was not part of any strategy. It was the truth. Then I asked her to hold off on signing anything, even if Bronson pushed. She agreed weakly. I could hear the conflict in her voice, the tug of loyalty pulling her in two directions. When she hung up, I watched as Bronson returned to the balcony door. He slid it open and stepped out, holding his phone to record a panoramic video of the harbor. He commented again about the listing price. He said someone he knew from his office would drop the transfer paperwork by the weekend. He said that once it was done, I could leave with dignity before things became public. For a few seconds I couldn't move. The sheer arrogance of it, mixed with a kind of clinical precision, made my skin prickle. The camera in the living room caught everything. His voice, his statements of ownership, his admission of forging and transferring, his photos for valuation, his timeline. For the first time since this began, I felt a shift inside me, a kind of click. The trap wasn't only set, it had closed. Bronson stayed in the condo for nearly 40 minutes, long enough to give me more evidence than any judge would ever require. When he finally left, he didn't even bother to straighten anything he'd disturbed. The moment the front door shut behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The condo felt different again. Not invaded this time, but reclaimed. I rolled forward slowly, leaving the safety of the bedroom, letting the familiar rooms open around me. The living room was quiet. The harbor light was beginning to soften. Everything looked normal, but none of it was the same. I moved to my desk and rested my hand lightly on the top drawer he'd opened earlier. My reflection hovered in the dark screen of the TV across the room. He thought he had won. He thought he was one signature away from controlling my life. He had no idea that the documents he needed were already sealed beyond his reach. No idea that every word he spoke today had been recorded. No idea that the next step in the story would not belong to him. I turned the lock on the front door myself. The click echoed through the condo. A small but certain sound. It was almost time for the endgame. The night before passed in that strange, slow way only sleepless nights can. I dozed in short stretches, never fully dropping into real rest. Every time my eyes closed, I saw Bronson in my living room again. Heard his voice saying I wouldn't see a single penny, that this condo belonged to him. When I did sleep, I dreamed in fragments. Dad driving down the coast, Mom laughing, Lydia as a child clutching my arm. I woke more than once gripping the side of the mattress. The ocean and city folding into a low hum around me. By the time the security alarm went off at 5 a.m., I was already half awake. The first thing I saw was not the ceiling, or the blinds, or even my own hands. It was the grainy but clear image from the lobby camera on my tablet. I had set it to stay open beside my bed. A quiet window into the entrance of Harborline Towers. When the building system detected something unusual at the gate, the feed jumped and the view shifted. Headlights slid across the pavement outside. A moving truck eased into the circle drive, big and white against the soft blue dawn. Its engine rumbled, a deep vibrating sound heavy vehicles make, the kind you feel in your chest more than hear. Behind it, a compact dark sedan followed and stopped just behind the loading zone. The lobby lights were still on their night setting, a little dimmer, a little warmer. The glass doors slid open and Trent stepped forward from the security desk, glancing toward whatever he could see through the front windows. His posture was tight, shoulders slightly raised. The way people look when they know something is wrong, but aren't yet sure how bad it will be. He'd already spoken to me a few moments earlier on the phone. His voice had been shaky, telling me Lydia and Bronson were downstairs with movers, insisting they owned my place now. I had told him to log them to keep everything in the book. Now I watched it unfold from a distance of 12 floors and a lifetime of preparation. Two men climbed out of the truck, rubbing sleep from their faces, pulling jackets tighter against the early morning chill. They slid the rear door up, revealing the empty space inside, waiting for someone else's life to be packed into it. The sight of that vacancy sent a strange shiver down my arms. Those men didn't know what they were stepping into. For them, this was just another job, a contract, an address on a clipboard. The camera feed caught the sedan doors opening almost in sync. Bronson came around the front of the car, his stride smooth and confident. He wore a dark coat over a pressed shirt, the kind of neat, respectable outfit that blended easily in any professional setting. In his hand, he carried a thick folder, the same style he had when he visited my condo before. That folder had become his prop, his shield, his weapon. Lydia emerged from the passenger side. Her shoulders were hunched inside a pale sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. From the camera's angle, I couldn't see her face clearly, but her body language spoke enough. She lingered half a step behind him, hands wrapped around herself like she was trying to stay warm from more than the morning air. Bronson reached back once and placed his hand on her shoulder. A gesture that might have been reassuring if I hadn't known him. To me, it looked like containment. They walked together toward the entrance. Trent met them just inside the sliding doors. The camera had no audio from that angle, but I could imagine the exchange. Identification, explanation, the calm, authoritative tone Bronson used when he wanted people to believe he belonged. The hesitancy in Trent's eyes, caught between the uniform on his back and the instincts in his gut. Bronson lifted the folder and opened it, fanning out documents with bold seals and neat lines of text. From the way he pointed line by line, I could tell he was indicating supposed proof of ownership. He gestured toward the ceiling, then toward the elevators. The movers watched, shifting their weight, waiting for a signal that they were allowed to proceed. I watched Trent pick up the visitor logbook, his pen moving as he wrote their names. Bronson Reeves, Lydia Reeves. The reason for the visit was probably something simple, neutral. Move in. Property transfer. Whatever words he used, I knew they would be important later. Every stroke of Trent's handwriting was another strand in the web that would either trap me or protect me. This time it would help me. On my bed, I shifted slightly, pulling the blanket farther over my legs. My heart was beating faster now, but not out of panic. It was the steady, focused rush that comes when everything you've planned starts to line up. The lobby camera shifted angles as the group moved toward the elevator. The movers carried folded dollies and stacks of flattened boxes. Bronson walked in front, speaking over his shoulder. Lydia followed, her arms held close, her gaze dropped to the floor. When the elevator doors slid open, they all stepped inside. The view cut off as the metal closed. I switched to the feed inside the service corridor. On the 12th floor, that camera captured the doors opening again and the small cluster of people stepping out into the elegant hallway that led toward my condo. The building was quiet at that hour. Most residents were still asleep or just waking up. No one was there to see this procession but me watching from above on a screen. Bronson led the way, the folder tucked under one arm. One of the movers pushed an empty dolly, the wheels squeaking faintly on the polished floor. You could almost feel the weight of the silence around them, broken only by their footsteps and the low rumble of the truck engine still idling below. When they reached my door, I felt a strange mix of fury and grim satisfaction rise in me. That door had been a line of safety for so long. I had crossed it again and again, coming home from doctor's appointments, from therapy sessions, from lonely errands. Now it was the line he believed he was crossing to claim victory. Trent had ridden up with them. The camera caught him standing a few feet back, his face cautious. He watched Bronson take out the stolen key again, then stop himself, as if remembering that today he was supposed to be legitimate. Instead, Bronson held up the folder and flipped to the top page. He tapped it once, then looked at Trent with an expression that said, "Of course, this is all in order." I couldn't hear the words, but I could see his mouth forming the familiar phrases. Property transfer. Deed. Owner of record. He held the papers up like a magic trick, daring anyone to doubt them. The movers glanced at one another, as if to ask silently, "Are we doing this?" One of them shrugged, clearly more concerned with being paid than with the finer points of property law. Bronson turned back to my door, pushed the key into the lock, this time in full view of the guard and the camera, and opened it, as if stepping into a place that already belonged to him. I switched to the inside feed, the camera in my living room that faced the entryway. The door swung open and Bronson walked in with a self-satisfaction that almost made me physically ill. The movers followed, looking around with quick, measuring eyes. The way men do when they're mentally dividing furniture into categories and loads. Lydia lingered at the threshold. For a long moment, she didn't cross into the condo. She stood with her fingers gripping the strap of her purse, staring at the familiar space. I saw the recognition in her posture. Every corner meant something to her. Nights we spent watching movies, dinners we shared, the time she and I celebrated her first real promotion with cheap champagne. In this very room, Bronson reached back and touched her elbow, guiding her in as if she were a reluctant guest instead of family. He snapped instructions to the movers, his tone brisk and controlled. He pointed toward the bedroom and the living room, then made a sweeping gesture that clearly meant, "Start with the big pieces." I watched one of the movers head down the hallway toward my room. The other began measuring the sofa with his eyes. Standing in my quiet bedroom, hidden from all of them, I kept my attention on the screen. The tension in my neck and shoulders tightened, but my breath stayed even. This was the moment everything had been designed for. Either the legal protections we put in place would intersect with his arrogance, or they wouldn't. There was nothing left for me to adjust. The movers at the bedroom door called something back to Bronson, and he waved his hand impatiently, giving permission without even looking. That small display of disregard told me everything about how he viewed my space. I wasn't a person to him now. I was an obstacle on a checklist he believed he'd already overcome. As the movers opened the door to my living room fully and began discussing how to get the furniture through it, the air in the condo seemed to shift. The harbor outside was pale gold now, the sky lightening from blue to soft peach. The city was waking up, people making coffee, turning on news programs, stepping into showers, having no idea what was happening on the 12th floor of a building by the water. I sat there in the shadows of my bedroom, the laptop screen glowing softly on the bed beside me, and watched as strangers made their first moves toward dismantling the life I had built. They thought. In reality, every step they took brought us all closer to the moment when Bronson would find out that the story he had written was not the one that would stand. The first sign that the tide was turning wasn't dramatic. It was a small flicker in the corner of my tablet screen where the exterior camera feed sat. A dark shape pulled into the drive behind the moving truck. Smaller, quieter, the outline of a patrol car with the familiar blue and white markings of the San Diego Police Department. Its headlights washed over the back of the moving truck, then dimmed as the engine shut off. I could almost feel Trent's relief through the camera. He stood near the lobby entrance, arms folded tightly, watching the movers begin to maneuver toward the elevators. When the patrol car doors opened and 2 officers stepped out, he moved toward the sliding glass doors, as if a pressure inside his chest had finally found a release valve. One officer was a woman in her 40s, compact and steady, her dark hair pulled back, her expression neutral but alert. The other was a younger man, tall, scanning the scene with the cautious curiosity of someone still learning how quickly situations can shift. The older officer spoke briefly with Trent. He gestured upward, toward the moving truck, toward the visitor logbook on his desk. This was the part Maribel and I had planned for. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would tip our hand too early. Just a quiet note from building management that something felt wrong. An unannounced move. A resident someone thought was out of town, but not officially. A key that hadn't been cleared through the concierge. Enough red flags to justify a welfare check. On my screen, I watched the officers ride the elevator up with Trent. The movers continued gathering boxes, not yet aware that anything was different. Bronson was in my living room, explaining to one of the men how he wanted the larger piece of furniture angled in the truck so it wouldn't be scratched. Lydia stood near the dining table, fingers pressed to her lips, looking anywhere but at the sofa they were about to take. The service corridor camera captured the elevator doors opening onto my floor again. The officers stepped out first, Trent following. The younger one adjusted his belt, his hand near his radio. The older one took in the hallway at a glance, her gaze landing on the open door of my condo, and the strange, half-seen scene beyond. Movers hovering over someone else's belongings before sunrise. She walked forward with a measured pace and stopped just outside my doorway. From my bedroom, hidden but watching, I saw her raise a hand slightly in a polite, firm gesture. She asked what was going on. Her voice carried just enough for the living room microphone to pick up. Bronson turned, the practiced smile already on his face, the deed folder tucked under his arm, like a passport to anywhere he wanted to go. He greeted her as if this were an inconvenience, nothing more. He said they were simply completing a move-in. He said he had the deed and transfer papers right there if she needed proof. He sounded so sure of himself that for a moment, if I hadn't known better, even I might have believed him. The officer asked to see the documents. She stepped just inside the living room, careful not to cross too far in before she understood the claim. Bronson opened the folder with a small flourish, and held out the papers he had waved at Trent earlier. A thick stack of printed pages, heavy with legal language and counterfeit authority. She took her time looking at them. She didn't rush, and she didn't let his confident commentary distract her. The camera caught the way her eyes lingered on the notary seal, the way her brow creased slightly as she traced the registration number with her gaze. She flipped to the recorded deed, the one that supposedly transferred ownership of my condo into his hands. She asked where the notary was registered. Bronson replied without missing a beat, saying something about an out-of-county contact, who handled things quickly for his firm. He said everything had been done properly. He said the seller had signed willingly. He gestured vaguely toward my hallway, as if I might appear as a supporting actor. The officer did not smile. She asked if he was aware that notaries who notarize California real estate transactions had to be properly registered, and that their commission numbers were easily verifiable. She mentioned that the registration number on the seal didn't match any active notary she knew of. That small sentence hung in the air like a crack of lightning in a quiet sky. I saw color drain slightly from his face before he caught himself. She also mentioned something else. She said property records showed that this unit was currently held in a special needs asset protection trust that had been filed and sealed with the probate court very recently. She asked how his documents accounted for that. That was Maribel's work, looping the police into the outline just enough that if a patrol car ever responded to my address, they wouldn't walk in blind. Bronson faltered for the first time. He said there must be a mistake. He said the trust was out of date. He said the woman who lived here didn't understand what she had signed, that she needed guidance, that he and his wife were stepping in to help her. He started to repeat the same phrases he'd used with Lydia. Not competent under stress. I need protection. I chose that moment to move. I rolled my chair out of the bedroom doorway and down the hallway, into view. The living room camera caught the shift in everyone's posture the instant they saw me. The movers froze, their hands still on the edges of my furniture. Lydia turned so fast her hair slipped from its knot, her eyes wide with something between hope and dread. Bronson's jaw tightened visibly before he smoothed his expression over. The officer looked at me and asked if I was the resident of the unit. I told her I was the legal owner, and that my name was on the trust documents she had just referenced. My voice sounded calm, even to my own ears. Years of training and months of planning had led to this exact moment. There was no room left for fear. She asked if I had given consent for this move. I told her plainly that I had not, that I had never sold my condo, that I had never authorized any transfer of ownership to Dalla Family Trust LLC, or to Bronson, or to anyone else, that I had not hired the moving company and never agreed to vacate my home. The younger officer moved a step closer to the movers and told them to hold off on touching anything else until things were clarified. One of the men lifted his hands off the sofa as if it were suddenly too hot. The other quietly nudged the dolly back a few inches. I turned my chair slightly toward the older officer and told her I had evidence. I told her that over the past weeks, Bronson had entered my unit without permission, using a stolen key, that I had video of him going through my drawers while I was gone. I had audio of him speaking about how I would never see a single penny from my settlement, how this condo would belong to him. I told her I had received mail for Dalla Family Trust LLC at my address, a company I had never formed, that a friend of mine with forensic training had examined signatures on documents Bronson had tried to introduce, and those signatures were proven to be forged. Maribel Stone had already filed my trust with the court and could confirm that any deed he was presenting was fraudulent and in conflict with recorded property records. I spoke steadily, each statement simple, factual, the way we were taught to deliver critical information under pressure. The officer listened without interrupting. Then she asked if I had copies. I reached to the small table beside my chair where I had placed a neat stack of folders before all of this had begun. I handed them to her one by one, video stills printed with timestamps, a summary letter from Dorian about the signature analysis, a copy of the fraudulent welcome packet addressed to Dalla Family Trust LLC, a copy of the court order establishing my Special Needs Asset Protection Trust. Her eyes moved over each page with increasing focus. The room was so quiet I could hear Lydia's unsteady breathing from across the space. Bronson tried to cut in. He said I was confused, that trauma had affected my memory, that I had agreed to some parts of the plan, but couldn't remember. He reached toward Lydia as if to pull her into his narrative. She flinched away for the first time. Her gaze moved between my face and the officers and the papers. She asked him, in a small voice, why he had told her I was losing track of things, why he had told her I would end up hurting myself with bad decisions if they didn't step in. Her words cracked halfway through, as if each one cost her something. He answered that he had only wanted to protect me, that everything he had done was for family. The older officer straightened, the folder still in her hands. She said that from where she was standing, what she saw looked less like protection and more like a calculated attempt to take control of assets that did not belong to him. She mentioned forgery, fraud, possible attempted grand theft given the value of the property and the known settlement from my accident. She added one more phrase that sent a chill even through me. Abuse of a dependent adult. I have never loved that term, dependent adult. It makes people like me sound helpless. But at that moment I understood its power when used correctly. It meant the law recognized that my disability made me a target in certain eyes. That exploiting that was not just ugly, it was criminal. She stepped closer to Bronson and asked very calmly if he had anything else. Any proof that contradicted the court records. Any legitimate notary confirmation. Any document signed in front of a registered witness. His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since he walked into my life, he seemed to understand that his confidence would not carry him out of this room. The younger officer moved behind him, near enough that the air in the condo seemed to thicken. The movers had backed almost all the way out to the hallway, their eyes wide. One of them said quietly that they just wanted to leave, that they had no idea there was any dispute. The younger officer told them they were free to go, that their involvement would be noted as witnesses only. They practically ran for the door, muttering apologies. Lydia took a step toward me, then stopped halfway. Tears were already slipping down her cheeks. She looked at Bronson with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. She asked him, her voice shaking, if he had ever truly loved her, or if she was just part of the plan. She said he had told her over and over that I didn't know what I was doing, that she needed to sign things to keep me safe, that if she loved me, she would help move everything into his hands so he could manage it. He didn't answer, or if he did, the words were low and desperate, drowned out by the sound of the older officer speaking quietly into a radio, requesting confirmation from dispatch about the notary registration, about the trust, about the prior report Maribel had filed on my behalf. She ended the call, nodded once to herself, then turned back to Bronson. She informed him that he was being detained on suspicion of forgery, fraud, attempted grand theft, and abuse of a dependent adult. She told him that anything he said could and would be used as evidence, and that he had the right to remain silent. The familiar cadence of those words filled the room. A litany I had heard before in other contexts, now aimed at someone who had believed himself untouchable. The younger officer gently took hold of Bronson's wrists and brought them behind his back. The metallic click of the cuffs sounded loud in the quiet condo. Lydia let out a sound, a broken half-sob that made my entire chest ache. He twisted his head toward me as they started to lead him out. There was no charm left in his face now, only rage and something that looked a lot like fear. He said I had set him up. He said I had planned this. He said none of it would hold. I met his eyes and told him simply that I had protected myself. That was all. As the officers guided him toward the door, the older one paused beside my chair. She told me that someone from the department's financial crimes unit would be in touch, that my attorney would receive the full report, that I had done the right thing by documenting everything. When they left, the condo fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the city waking up and Lydia's quiet, shaking breaths. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The door had closed behind Bronson. The cuffs had taken his hands away from my belongings. But the shock of what almost happened still hung in the air. We were finally safe. But nothing about this felt simple. Lydia stood in the middle of my living room, her hands trembling at her sides. The early morning light had reached the windows by then, softening the room, making everything look gentler than it felt. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, as if her mind were trying to rearrange the last hour into something that made sense. She finally looked at me, not at my wheelchair, not at the scattered papers still lying on the table, but at me, her sister, the girl who had raised her, the woman she had trusted and doubted in the same breath because someone else had whispered the right lies in the right order. She walked toward me slowly, like she was approaching something fragile. When she reached me, she knelt beside my chair and rested her forehead on my knee. Her whole body shook as she started to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, but with the quiet grief of someone who finally understood the depth of the betrayal she had lived under. I placed my hand gently on the back of her head, brushing her hair the way I used to when she was small and woke from nightmares. After a moment, she whispered that she was sorry, again and again. Sorry for believing him, sorry for repeating his words back to me. Sorry for nearly helping him take the last pieces of our life that Mom and Dad left us. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. Manipulators don't need intelligence or kindness to work. They need vulnerability. They need love. They need someone who tries to see the good in others, the way she always had. None of that was her fault. We stayed like that for a long while. Her kneeling, me holding her, the condo finally quiet again. The days that followed were a blur of statements and confirmations. SDPD took the footage. They interviewed Trent and the movers. They verified the forged notary number, the falsified deed, the LLC filings tied to Bronson's email. Every thread he had pulled on unraveled under scrutiny. Every lie he had crafted folded in on itself. He was charged with forgery, fraud, attempted grand theft, and abuse of a dependent adult. His arraignment came quickly. The court read out the accusations in a tone so dry and factual it almost removed the emotional weight of it all. But not quite. Lydia sat beside me in the gallery, her hands clasped together, her shoulders stiff. He glared at both of us when he was let out, as if we had undone some great design rather than simply defending ourselves. But that glare held no power anymore. It was only the last flicker of a man cornered by his own ambition. When the restraining order was finalized, Lydia exhaled like she had been holding her breath for months. Within 2 weeks, she filed for divorce. She moved out of their apartment, packed her clothes, her work supplies, and one worn-out shoebox of childhood mementos she'd forgotten she still kept. Then she moved into a small rental 5 minutes from my building, close enough that she could stop by after work, or on the nights when the silence of her place felt too large. She told me she felt embarrassed, foolish for falling for him, ashamed she didn't see what he was doing sooner. I told her that shame belonged entirely to him. The human heart is not weak because it trusts. It is human. The district attorney contacted me twice more for updates, but the case moved forward without complications. Fraud is one thing, forgery is another. Attempting to seize the assets of a disabled woman after entering her home with a stolen key, while recording himself admitting his intentions, is something prosecutors rarely see with such clarity. Life began settling again, slowly, like dust after a storm. For the first time in months, I felt something inside me begin to loosen. I started rolling my chair out onto the balcony every morning, the way I used to before this ordeal. The ocean air always carried a mix of salt and diesel from the harbor, a scent that felt oddly comforting. Boats drifted out into the channel. Gulls wheeled lazily overhead. People walked the marina path with coffee cups in hand, unaware of how close I had come to losing the home that held all the memories I had left of my parents. One morning, while holding my mug and watching the lights spread across the water, Lydia joined me. She leaned her elbows on the railing beside my chair, and told me she had been thinking about everything that had happened. She said she wanted to do something meaningful with the experience. Something that made her feel less like a victim and more like someone who could protect others. Her words stayed with me. That afternoon, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, and for the first time since the accident, I felt the old sense of purpose return. Not the bureau version of me, the one who combed through surveillance reports and briefings, but the part of me that understood patterns and people and warning signs. I started by drafting a simple outline. A workshop, nothing big at first. A discussion series for women about financial red flags, legal boundaries, and the subtle manipulation tactics that make even the smartest person doubt their own instincts. I called a community center near Harbor Line Towers and asked if they ever hosted educational sessions. The director said they would love to include something like that. Within a month, I was speaking to groups of 15 or 20 women at a time, seated in a semicircle while I talked about the tactics people like Bronson use, how they isolate, how they plant doubt, how they slowly frame control as protection, and how every woman deserves the knowledge and tools to guard her own life. The first time I stood at the front of that room, my chair angled toward the audience, I felt something shift. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it sits in a wheelchair with a stack of manila folders and a memory full of lessons carved by fire. Lydia came to every session she could. She volunteered to help organize the sign-in sheets and refreshments. Watching her regain her clarity, her confidence, her warmth reminded me that healing doesn't always require erasing what hurt us. Sometimes it requires understanding it deeply enough that we never let it happen again. Late one evening, weeks after the case had moved into its next phase, I found myself back on the balcony. The harbor was dark, except for the soft twinkle of lights along the shore. The air felt cooler, the night stretching wide and calm. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth settle in me, and thought about the long road from the accident to this moment. About the people who stepped into my life to harm me, and the people who stepped in to help. About the strength it took to stay patient when anger felt easier. And about how justice, when it finally arrives, rarely looks like vengeance. It looks like the truth, solid enough to stand on. Revenge doesn't always require fury. Sometimes it only requires silence, timing, and one well-placed signature the day before everything comes crashing down. What would you have done if your own family, or someone close, tried to take everything from you? Have you ever had to trust your gut when everyone else was telling you to ignore it? Tell me what you think. I really want to know in the comments below.